I think we're going to go ahead and get started here so we can get everyone moving on their afternoon. We're going to talk with the U.S. Trade Representative Michael Froman about TPP, TTIP, some other issues that are at play today in our politics, and sort of where the place of international trade is now on the political agenda on both sides, which is not very high on the list of favorite things of both parties right now. But let's start with TPP and exactly where we are in the process of getting this through Congress before the end of the Obama administration. Obviously, your goal to do that, been moving forward on it, but there's a lot of skepticism that it can get done this year. And if it gets done, maybe it's done in the lame duck. And that if it doesn't get done, and the next president has it, whether it's President Trump or President Clinton, it may sit around for a while and not get passed. So give us the lay of the land. Where's TPP now? Is it going to get done? When's it going to get done?
So after 5.5 years of negotiation, we finished it in October. We published it in November. We signed it in February. It's now ready to be picked up by Congress. As you suggested, we're working with congressional leaders and with the leaders of the committees to lay all the groundwork and the foundation for it to be taken up as they think through what the most propitious window is for it to be considered. We have a few outstanding issues we're working on. We're preparing the implementing bill, and we're spending a lot of time up with members of Congress going through the agreement, talking about what's in there, how it benefits their constituents, how it benefits key stakeholders, and getting a very positive response on the substance. But obviously, they're all very much focused as well on the politics of it, and that's what we need to work through with the congressional leadership.
Good luck with that is my advice to you.
But it will happen.
Yeah, it will happen. Okay.
It will happen. It will happen
so
because
when?
I think, well, our goal is certainly to get it done this year. We think there is a pathway forward to doing that, particularly as members of Congress learn more about the benefits that accrue to their constituents and the benefits that are at risk by not moving forward. The risks of delay, the costs of delay, letting other folks move ahead with their own trade agreements at our expense. I think for all those reasons, at the end of the day, it'll get done this year.
Okay. I realized I didn't tell you who I am. Some of you know, some of you don't. I'm Ben White. I'm the chief economic correspondent for Politico. I write the Morning Money column, which you should all read. If you don't, I will sign you up and we'll get you to read it. So, all right, let's get back to...
I read it.
Very good. Yeah, he noticed, I don't know if you saw the picture of my kid in there, or maybe that was on Twitter. Anyway, we're talking about birthdays up here. On the timing of it, well, let's first talk about some of the stumbling blocks, the problems that members have with it right now. And the big one that gets talked about the most is biologics and Senator Hatch's concerns over intellectual property protection. Where does that stand now? Have you convinced him? Have you convinced others on the biologics front that there's enough protection in there? And on the other side, you've got people like Joe Stiglitz saying this is a total giveaway to the pharma industry that is going to make it more difficult for more people to get cheaper drugs.
Well, first, having strong intellectual property rights and intellectual property rights enforcement in the agreement was important to us. We have 40 million Americans who owe their jobs to IP-intensive industry. Much of the pharmaceutical innovation is done in this country. And our approach was to make sure we're creating an environment that's supportive of innovation while at the same time ensuring there's access to medicines, particularly by the poor in developing countries. The overall chapter on IP, I think, is quite strong when it comes to promoting innovation. But the outstanding issue, as you pointed out, is the question of biologics, and it really comes down to how many years of data protection do we provide companies for their invention of biologics. The US, we have 12 years in our law. The other countries in TPP, 5 of them had 0 years, 4 of them had 5 years, 2 of them had 8 years, and we ended up at 8 years. And we are continuing to work with the industry as well as the generics industry and members of Congress, including Chairman Hatch and others who care deeply about this issue, to try and address their issues, recognizing that at 12 years, none of the other countries were willing to sign on to that, but that the package overall is certainly significantly better than the status quo, and strikes that appropriate balance between making sure there is an innovation environment, an ecosystem that U.S. companies can thrive in, while at the same time ensuring access to medicines.
Right. What do you make of comments from people like Stiglitz who say that this is, written by the pharmaceutical companies for the pharmaceutical companies and would be a huge benefit to them and a detriment to consumers?
Well, all I can say is the pharmaceutical companies are, I think, probably the last major industry that is not supporting TPP yet, and so they certainly don't feel like they wrote the chapter, but we want to make sure that they have the assurances they need, while at the same time ensuring that we can get access to drugs in developing countries. As we look back at our previous FTAs, as countries strengthen their IP regimes, it did not lead to a decline in access to medicine. It did not lead to an increase in prices of medicine.
Right.
We have examples of where, take Peru, for example, that it improved its intellectual property rights regime around the FTA we did with them 7 years ago, and now they're seeing more drugs in their market and at equivalent or cheaper prices.
Yeah.
So we want to. We don't think there is an inherent contradiction between making sure we get innovative drugs into the market, and making sure that there's access to it.
Yeah. Help me understand some process things around TPP, and that is if you have members who have issues with certain things, biologics, pork, dairy, whatever else that you have to talk to these people about, is there a mechanism for, it's done. How do you change it if it's the language is complete and agreed to by the signatory
It's done,
nations?
it's signed, and in our view, it is not open to renegotiation.
Right.
It's a much more complicated agreement than a bilateral free trade agreement where you can tweak things at the margins. Here, everything is related to everything else, and every country is looking at the balance that they were able to get out of the negotiations compared to the other countries. Having said that, there are, we believe, things we can do through the implementation process, through the legislative process, as we focus on how countries are meeting their obligations to address outstanding concerns. And those are the kinds of conversations we're having with stakeholders who have particular issues, and whether it's dairy or pork or financial services or the pharmaceutical.
Right. We can get into some of those individual ones, but I want to understand the process a little bit better in terms of implementation of some changes that might be agreed to in the selling process with Congress. Once it's in place, there is some sort of implementation committee that is set up, right, that can then make changes. Just explain to me the process by which, if the agreement is changed, how it will be changed once it's in place and agreed.
I think it's more the focus is on, for example, we'll be drafting an implementing bill with Congress. We'll be drafting something called a Statement of Administrative Action, which is what the U.S. intention is as to how to interpret provisions of the agreement. We'll be working with the countries to make sure that they are bringing their systems into compliance with the obligations. And through those processes, we think there's opportunities to address some of these outstanding issues.
Right.
But we do not think that it's open to renegotiation.
Right. Okay. There are some Republicans who are unsure of supporting this because they believe there will be this sort of supranational body set up that would take authority on trade issues away from the U.S. Congress and would instead be this group of bureaucrats from all the signatory nations that would have power over U.S. trade policy. Disabuse them of that.
Yeah, no, look, I think ultimately any changes, for example, to U.S. law can only be made by Congress. That's why we have Trade Promotion Authority, that's why we have an implementing bill, that's why we go through this process with Congress. And so we can't, through some other mechanism, change U.S. law or regulation. There are, under all of our FTAs, there are mechanisms where the countries come together and try and address issues as they arise in implementation. But that's different than saying it's open to renegotiation or for new policies or laws that aren't approved by Congress. Everything we do in trade policy has to be approved by Congress. And trade policy has been designed to be a partnership between the executive and Congress. Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. The executive has the right to negotiate international agreements. And it's that combination that has led to the Trade Promotion Authority process where we work. I'm not aware of any other area of policy where the executive and Congress work more closely together than trade policy.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the timing and try to drill down a little bit into the specifics of it. The conventional wisdom certainly is that the Congress is not going to want to vote on this before the campaign is over, given that Republican frontrunner is very much anti-free trade, anti-TPP. The Democratic frontrunner was once in favor, now says she can't support it as it's currently written. And you've got pressures on both parties, populist pressures to not agree to free trade agreement. So that gets us to the Lameduck Session. Is the lame duck the only opportunity to pass TPP through Congress?
Well, we would like to get it done as early as possible this year. I think Leader McConnell has made clear, at least in the Senate, that he'd rather not see any vote prior to the election. But even if the final vote is to happen in the lame duck session, there's work that needs to be done before that to lay the foundation, and that's the kind of work that we are laying the groundwork for right now. I think we spent a lot of our time up in Congress talking to members one-on-one or in groups going through the agreement. And I think it's noteworthy that those members have said they're going to make their decision about whether they support or not support this agreement based on what it means for their constituents, for the stakeholders they care about. And that's what they're looking to do. They're digging down deeply into the agreement. They're asking good and hard questions, giving us an opportunity to explain what's in it. And I think we're building the necessary support for it through that process.
Beyond the biologics, what are the most often cited sticking points that you have to address with Congress? What do you hear most people are wanting changed or not comfortable with?
I think there were initially a handful of issues. The dairy industry, for example, both sees great opportunity in expanding its exports, but is also very import sensitive and wanted to make sure the agreement on balance met their needs. And they, over the last 6 weeks or so, completed their analysis and came out in support of the agreement. So I think we're in good shape there. We need to obviously make sure that the dairy provisions that other countries have agreed to are fully implemented as intended, and we'll be vigilant about that. The pork folks have some issues about implementation, particularly by Japan, and we're working through those issues with them and trying to give them assurances. There's an issue around financial services and data flows, and our Treasury Department, Treasury Secretary have had very good interaction with regulators and with the industry and are continuing to make progress on that. And so those are the major, I think, outstanding issues.
Okay, and in terms of final passage, I mean, the assumption is that the votes are there. You don't need a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate because of the TPA. So votes would be there in the House. You've got the Speaker for it, the Majority Leader for it, the President who would sign it. So all of those things are in place. Assuming it gets pushed to the lame duck, you would assume that the votes would be there to finish it.
Well, we're certainly, coming off of Trade Promotion Authority last year, I think we have a pretty clear sense of where the votes are, where we may be vulnerable, where we have opportunities to pick up votes. We're not taking anybody for granted in either the House or the Senate on either side of the aisle, but we do feel that as this process continues, we'll ultimately have the necessary support.
Did it surprise you that Rob Portman came out against it? I mean, this is a former U.S. trade rep, very pro-business, pro-trade Republican who admittedly is in a tough re-election fight with somebody who's very anti-trade, but he came out and said he couldn't support it in its current form. Did that surprise you, and what did you make of the concerns that he raised?
Well, he's raised a couple of concerns, including currency.
Yeah.
I think probably his primary concern. He's not alone in that regard. This is the first trade agreement that actually has a currency arrangement among the 12 countries, where the finance authorities have agreed to what's the criteria for appropriate exchange rate policy. They've agreed to a series of transparency mechanisms, so we'll now be able to see what central banks are doing and when in terms of intervening in the markets. And there's an accountability mechanism where they'll judge each other against those criteria. What it doesn't have, which I think others have suggested, it doesn't end with trade sanctions.
Right.
Because our view is we would never subject our Federal Reserve and monetary policy to trade sanctions. Other countries view our monetary policy and quantitative easing as having an effect on relative currency values, and no other country would either. And so we stop short of that, but I don't think we should underestimate the importance of this first step in terms of a currency arrangement, of now having one for the first time in the context of a trade agreement.
Right. I mean, does it sort of surprise you the extent to which people, I think they believe that past trade agreements have dealt with currency manipulation, or they think now all of a sudden they should be filled with these provisions that would address currency manipulation, but it's never been a trademark of trade deals to include those things.
Well, no, it hasn't. It's always been handled separately, and I think the Treasury Department, of course, has the lead in this issue. They've worked it through mechanisms like the G7 and the G20, the IMF, through their foreign currency exchange reports, which just came out,
Right.
The most recent one last week. Congress, in the context of some recent legislation, gave the Treasury Department some additional tools to deal with issues of currency manipulation, so that helps strengthen their hand vis-a-vis other countries. And I think those are important steps forward, that together with this agreement in TPP.
Yeah. Let's pull back the lens a little bit and just talk about the current political climate surrounding free trade and globalization, which has obviously shifted a great deal over the last few years. And first talk about it from the perspective of the Democratic Party, which there used to be a pretty sizable coalition in the party that was pro-free trade, understood that globalization was happening and couldn't be reversed. And the best approach was to try to take best advantage of it. That part of the Democratic Party is in retreat. The Bernie Sanders wing obviously is ascendant, and he is very much against most of these agreements. He's moved Hillary Clinton to the left to the point where she's opposed it. Why can't you be a pro-free trade Democrat anymore? What happened to it?
Well, trade agreements and trade legislation have tended to pass largely with Republican votes and then a critical mass of Democrats. And as few as 15 Democrats, I believe, voted for CAFTA or for the last version of Trade Promotion Authority. We had 28 vote for Trade Promotion Authority last year in the House. And the range has been from 15 to 70 or so, depending on the agreement historically. Look, I think in both parties, and I think you see some similarities in both parties, there clearly is a great deal of anxiety out there about the changing nature of work in America. And we see it even with the 14 million new private sector jobs, even though unemployment has been cut in half to 5%, even though we're growing relatively well compared to the rest of the industrialized world, even though we've added 900,000 manufacturing jobs in the last 6 years, the longest period of manufacturing job creation since the 1960s. People are still quite anxious about wage stagnation, about rising income inequality. And while economists will tell you these things are probably more a factor of automation than globalization, globalization has certainly played a role.
Yeah.
I think the challenge is people tend to conflate globalization and trade agreements.
Yeah.
Globalization is a force. It's a factor of the containerization of shipping and the spread of broadband and the integration of economies like China and Eastern Europe that used to be closed and integrating them into the global economy. It's happening. That's a genie we can't put back in the bottle. The question is whether we can use trade agreements to shape globalization. And that's exactly what we're trying to do through our trade agenda, by opening other markets disproportionately, since we're already an open market, and then in raising standards in those countries, labor and environmental standards and other standards, so that there's a more level playing field. Gives an incentive to keep production, expand production in the United States, and then export to the rest of the world. But people don't get to vote on automation.
Yeah.
They don't get to vote on the next generation of robots. They don't really get to vote on globalization,
Right.
because it's just a factor. Trade agreements become the vessel into which I think they pour a lot of their broader economic anxieties, and I think that's one reason why it's become more controversial.
Yeah, we can come back to this, but you talking about setting the standards through these free trade agreements, and President Obama has an op-ed that just went up in the Washington Post talking about the urgency surrounding TPP and the need to have it approved. So China does not set the rules of trade in the region. Talk to me a little bit about that, what the president is saying there, and how he's trying to sort of light a fire under Congress to get this done by citing what the Chinese might do if it doesn't get done.
Well, I think he makes the point well that we're not the only party out there trying to move towards greater integration of the Asia-Pacific region. And China right now has the One Road, One Belt initiative. It has the Silk Road initiative. It has the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and it has something called RCEP, which is a 16-member trade agreement that they have been working very hard to try and complete this year. And that agreement doesn't have labor and environmental standards, and it doesn't have the kind of IP standards that we have in TPP. TPP for the first time in any trade agreement takes on the issue of state-owned enterprises and puts disciplines on state-owned enterprises to make sure when they compete with our private firms that they're not undermining them because of the subsidies they get. RCEP doesn't have that. Now, RCEP doesn't have a commitment to a free and open internet like TPP does. Again, the first time a trade agreement has taken on the digital economy. So the president's making the point that we're either going to write the rules of the road with our trading partners, or China is. And the rules of the road that China is going to write for the region aren't necessarily going to reflect our interests and our values. And it cannot be more in the interests of American workers and American firms that we cede that role to China or to anybody else, as opposed to us playing that leadership role in writing the rules.
I mean, if TPP were to get done and signed, I mean, obviously the administration's hope is that down the road China would feel compelled to join and abide by these rules that are set down in TPP on labor, environmental standards, other issues. But what's to stop China from just having a parallel path of their own that would, you know, have a different set of rules and guidelines? What's to say that China would actually become a TPP country?
Well, whether or not they ever become a TPP country, in our view, they're going to have to live in a TPP world.
Right.
And that's a world in which their neighbors are offering better labor and environmental practices, respect for intellectual property rights, real dispute settlement, mechanisms for getting recourse, and they're trying to distinguish themselves in the region from China and attract economic activity to their country, whether it's Vietnam, Malaysia, or others. And they want to be part of this club. You know, in addition to the 12 countries that are part of TPP, we now have another, I believe, 12 economies who've expressed interest in joining TPP. They want to be part of this platform and want to sign on to these high standards. And that's going to force China to up its game as well, to compete in a TPP world. And that's in everybody's interest, including China's.
Right. Can you explain to me Hillary Clinton's evolution on this issue, you know, being the gold standard of trade agreements when she was at the State Department to, well, I really have some serious questions about some of these things. It's not enough trade adjustment assistance in there. It's not, you know, fair enough to workers. I mean, the obvious answer is it's purely political, and that's probably the correct answer. But is there any substance to her opposition to TPP now versus when she was a big proponent of it at State?
I think I will demur and let others answer for individual candidates.
Well, what about just the specific thing she said, which was not enough trade adjustment assistance?
Well, as part of getting Trade Promotion Authority done last year, we actually got a 6-year renewal of trade adjustment assistance, which is actually, I think, the longest renewal ever. It also is an expanded trade adjustment assistance program that covers services workers, not just manufacturing workers, and not just workers who've been displaced by FTA countries, but by any force of globalization, whether it's from China or India or a number of other countries that we don't have a trade agreement with. So it's a very good program. Now, I think there's obviously more, and I think one of the interesting things about the current debate is more and more people are saying, you know, we need to do more to help people who are displaced by globalization. We do need to do more to help them train for the new kinds of jobs in the new economy. And that's a very healthy debate, and hopefully that will lead to further action of that sort as well.
Do you think it's true when people say that if the TPP is not done before President Obama leaves office, that even if it's Hillary Clinton in the White House in 2017, that she would let it sit because if she wins, she will have won with a great deal of help from organized labor, a lot of which opposes this deal, that if it doesn't get done, she's going to have to sit on it for a couple of years before she can do anything with it. Is it do or die for TPP in 2016?
You know, again, it's a good try, but
I'm going to keep coming back to it.
I will still not speak for any candidate. Like all I will say is we have a window of opportunity now. You have a president, a majority leader, and a Speaker of the House who are all pro-trade, who've all been involved in the shepherding of TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, and the TPP negotiations through. And while some of them may have issues with particular, or may have questions about particular issues in the agreement, I think fundamentally they all believe this is something important to get done.
Right.
And that creates a window of opportunity that won't be open forever.
Yeah.
We also have, as I mentioned, the fact that China and others are moving ahead already. You know, the cattlemen came in to see me. They've already calculated that because Australia already has a FTA with Japan, we're losing $120 million a year of beef exports because Australia has a lower tariff into Japan than we do.
Right.
And that will just that gap will only widen as time goes on. There's a real cost of delay here. The Peterson Institute estimates the cost of delay is over $90 billion to the U.S. economy. That's the equivalent of about $700 per American family.
Right.
So we have a choice between passing TPP, eliminating 18,000 taxes on U.S. exports, or delaying TPP and imposing a $700 tax on every American family.
Right.
And I think ultimately that's another reason why we are confident that it will get done.
Okay, I want to come back to TPP later, and I also want to get into some of the Donald Trump worldview of global trade and how he would make it so much more classy and better. But I want to, before doing that, talk about TTIP, because you were just in Europe and you were just in New York doing another round of talks on that. That's not something that anyone thinks can get enacted before the president leaves office, but at least you could have a framework deal done. Give us an update on the status of TTIP and remaining sticking points. Where are we? What are you going to produce before you ride off into the sunset?
Well, our goal remains to get it done this year. As you said, not through Congress, but to actually reach an agreement with the European Union. And it's got to be a good agreement, a comprehensive agreement. No TTIP light. We want to make sure we're covering all the major issues that we've laid out for ourselves. We've just finished the 13th round of negotiations. A lot of good progress made, but we do need to continue. And over the last 6 months, I'd say we've seen accelerated progress. We need to make sure that accelerated progress continues. We're now meeting almost constantly, at either the negotiator level, or I'm seeing my counterpart, Commissioner Malmstrom, virtually every 2 or 3 weeks. And that's going to be necessary to really push through here. The president was recently in Hanover, Germany, for the Hanover Messe. Talked a lot about TTIP while he was there, including with Chancellor Merkel. There's, I think, a lot of high-level political support across Europe for TTIP, but that needs to get translated into real progress at the negotiating table, finding pragmatic solutions to the outstanding issues.
And do the Europeans have the bandwidth to deal with this, given that, we've got the threat of Brexit coming up, we've got, European immigration problems, the Syrian crisis, a lot of political pressures, populist political pressures in a lot of these countries. Can they deal with TTIP at the same time? There are so many pressing European issues, including economies that are not exactly gangbusters.
Yeah, I think that is the main outstanding question right now. I mean, they have, as you said, the migrant crisis, the Brexit vote, the Greek crisis. You have uneven economic growth. You have a lot of Euroscepticism across various countries. A lot of public concern, and the question is whether these leaders and the Commission will provide the necessary momentum to get it done when they've got a lot of centrifugal forces acting upon them. Our view is that at a time when there are these centrifugal forces, TTIP can be a positive agenda item, something that Europe can do together and can do with us together to help promote growth and jobs in Europe, which are desperately needed, as well as position themselves to play a leadership role with us around the rest of the world in setting and raising standards.
Yeah. I want to sort of go back in history a little bit to explain where we are in the current attitude towards trade. And you have Bernie Sanders out there saying that, and Trump says this too on the other side, but that NAFTA was a disaster for the United States and a huge destroyer of manufacturing jobs, and that China's entry into the WTO, also a huge disaster for the United States. I mean, this is not how, a few years ago people would have talked about these things. Address those two, NAFTA's impact and China and WTO. Have they been a huge disaster for the United States?
Well, look, I think whether you think NAFTA has been on net positive or negative for the U.S. economy, TPP isn't NAFTA.
Right.
And when Senator Obama was running for president, he said he wanted to renegotiate NAFTA. And he was very clear on what that meant. And he said it meant taking labor and environment, making them core to the agreement, and making them fully enforceable like any other provisions of the agreement. And that's exactly what TPP does. TPP is the renegotiation of NAFTA because it's got the strongest labor and environmental provisions of any trade agreement. in history, and it is fully enforceable, including through the imposition of trade sanctions. But it's not just Canada and Mexico, it's 40% of the global economy that will now have those kinds of rules. Right. And so, as the president often says, past trade agreements may not have been perfect, and we shouldn't ignore that, and we should learn from them and build on that experience. But that's exactly what we've tried to do in TPP, which is to learn from that experience and try and address those issues, including the labor and environmental concerns.
Right. And what about the criticism of China joining the World Trade Organization as a net negative for the U.S.?
Yeah, it's always hard to make the counterfactual. What would China's role be in the global economy now if it were not part of the WTO? Would it be engaged in even more mercantilist, corporatist policies that create problems for the rest of the global economy? I think, in our view, China's accession to the WTO certainly had an impact on companies who, at least initially, decided to move production there. And now we see companies some pulling back and bringing production back to the United States, or reassessing given the changing nature of costs and the downsides of producing in long extended supply chains, that there's more desire to be back in the U.S. or in other closer by economies. I think the key issue is that WTO has put some constraints around China, but we have to be very aggressive about using all the tools at our disposal, both our domestic trade laws and our rights under the WTO, to hold them to account. And whenever we see them violating those laws, we need to do that. I think one thing we've learned through this experience is that the WTO rules don't go far enough, that there are forms of behavior that can have a negative impact on us that are not necessarily violations of the WTO. And that's why in TPP and in TTIP, our goal is to certainly agree to standards that are higher than the WTO.
Right.
I mean, things that we've done in TPP, for example, on whether it's labor and environment, or the state-owned enterprises and subsidies, or just how making sure that countries adopt regulations that are consistent with science and evidence. They don't use regulations as a disguised barrier to trade. Those provisions go beyond the WTO, and they address, in part, the kinds of concerns we've seen out of China and elsewhere, to say we need to be using our trade negotiations to raise standards to address the problems that the WTO has not been able to address thus far.
Right. What do you make of some of the rhetoric on both sides in the presidential campaign that we somehow can bring back low-end manufacturing jobs, sort of low-skill manufacturing jobs through a different kind of trade policy, a more aggressive kind of trade policy, or tariffs or taxes? We'll get into some of the specific proposals from Trump on tariffs on Mexico and China, but do you have sympathy with the idea that somehow we can bring those jobs back, even though we have so much more automation, and we're not going to compete on wages for a lot of the lowest skilled manufacturing jobs?
Well, first, I was surprised to learn that by the end of 2015, we were actually approaching an all-time high in terms of manufacturing production in the U.S. Higher than World War II, higher than the 50s and 60s.
Production, but not jobs.
With fewer jobs, right? And that, of course, is a reflection of automation and the fact that the workplace has changed. But for the popular perception out there that we don't make anything in America, that we don't manufacture anything, is simply wrong. We are manufacturing
just have good robots who make them.
Than ever before. And I think one thing we're seeing, in part because of the energy revolution that we've seen over the last handful of years, is more investment in manufacturing in the U.S., particularly in energy-intensive industries. I've been visited by European car manufacturers who say the cost of energy in the U.S. is 1/4 of what it is in their countries. They want to move their next production facility to the U.S. in order to sell back to Europe because the differential is so great. Well, we want to be that place that people want to produce. And our whole goal here between TPP and TTIP is that when we're done with those two agreements, we'll be at the center of a network of agreements that give us free trade with 2/3 of the global economy.
Right.
And that makes the U.S. a very attractive place to manufacture,
Yeah.
both to serve the U.S. market, but also to export to Latin America, to Asia, and to Europe.
Yeah.
And that's really what this is all about, is driving more production back to the U.S.
And how does corporate tax reform and international tax reform fit into that? I mean, obviously, if you want to be the place where these companies want to remain headquartered and not take advantage of lower corporate tax rates abroad, I mean, obviously you work on the trade side of it, but it would seem to me part of a sort of holistic picture of how you improve the employment base in manufacturing or any other industry. You'd want a competitive corporate tax code, and you'd want to not have some of the barriers that are there now to companies sticking around.
I think it's fair to say there's been a lot of conversation on both sides of the aisle and between the executive and Congress about the merits of comprehensive tax reform. Hasn't gotten done to date, but I think there's a lot of interest on both sides for making it more competitive, making the U.S. a better place to do manufacturing in that regard. But it's got to be comprehensive, and that means it's got to be fair as well.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about Trump and some of the things he said on the campaign trail. I mean, he obviously likes to say that we're getting our butts handed to us by China and by Mexico, and that he would punish the Chinese by placing a 45% tariff on their exports to us. And then he said, well, that's just a threat, maybe not 45%, maybe a slightly lower number. I think he's talking about 35% for Mexico. And now these are things that I think conceivably he could actually do, whereas building a wall with Mexico would be harder. Some of the other things that he's proposed doing would be harder, but he has some, not entirely, the executive doesn't have entire leeway to implement these things, but he would have some room to run in how he would apply some of these trade policies. What does he get right and wrong about trade, and what would happen if we put a 45% tariff on Chinese imports into the U.S. and a 35% on Mexico?
Well, look, I think, again, without commenting on particular candidates' positions, you'll see.
Which you're going to do exactly here without.
But I would point you, there have been some interesting analyses out there. I know the Washington Post has done one. I know Mark Zandi has done one of looking at the proposals and trying to assess what the impact would be, both of imposing tariffs on imports into the U.S. and then assuming that the countries would retaliate against us as they would have the right to do under the WTO. And those analyses point to the fact that it would largely put us into recession, causing the loss of millions of jobs. And again, I can't speak for their analysis, but it certainly would take us down a different path than the one we've been on in terms of trying to open up other markets and create incentives for production here that can then take advantage of these fast-growing markets abroad.
Right. And I mean, do you think the sort of national mood that is no longer very pro-free trade is, I mean, obviously it's a reflection of wage stagnation. It's a reflection of slow-growing economy, even though we have 5% unemployment across the board. Is it a failure of communication of whatever the benefits are of global free trade, or what the alternatives, if we were not to pursue some of these agreements, how that would be create negative outcomes for us? Why are people now so hesitant to embrace more trade, more exports, more global growth through trade?
Well, first, I think we should be a little careful about assuming exactly what the public opinion is, because I've seen a wide range of polls, which, not surprisingly, depending on how you ask the question, produces different results. Also, it's very interesting to see how different cohorts respond. Younger people tend to be more internationalist. Many have more of them have passports. More of them expect to live or travel abroad. More of them get that they're part of a global economy and see it as a source of opportunity as opposed to a threat than some who are older. But I think when you ask people, still the majority of the country believes we have to engage internationally and believes that our future is very much tied to how we interact with these other countries and our ability to engage in the global economy and to shape that. And that's exactly what we're trying to do through these trade agreements. To go to your question, though, I think there's an inherent asymmetry around trade, which is that the benefits of trade are often broadly spread, not necessarily very visible, whether it's as a consumer and the fact that you're able to, your paycheck will go farther in terms of buying food and clothing and shoes than they otherwise would. And the estimates are that the trade liberalization since the Second World War has added about $13,000 to an average American family's income simply by opening up our own market. Or because your wages go up slightly because you're in a more productive end of the industry because of trade liberalization and increased competitive pressures. So the benefits tend to be broadly spread and not particularly visible, while the costs, the factory down the street that closed down and laid off 200 people tend to be more acute, particularly for the 200 people in that community, their families in that community, and more obvious. And that, I think, presents a real public affairs challenge. It's not just a communications issue. When we travel around the world, many other countries who are more dependent, because we're such a large domestic market, trade actually plays a relatively small role in our economy compared to European countries or many Asian countries that are so much more dependent on trade. There's a much greater appreciation in those countries of both the costs and the benefits of trade and how best to deal with them. But it goes back to your earlier question. Because the costs are acute and obvious, we need to continue to do a better job of trying to address them.
We've got a lot of smart folks in the room. I want to open it up a little bit if there are questions from audience members. I know we've got Jared Bernstein, the smart guy back here, Alan Kruger up in front. If you have a question for Ambassador Froman, I would be happy to open it up to anyone who does. I'll continue to grill him mercilessly until somebody comes up with a question. So, all right, so what other priorities do you have? And think of good questions for him, and I'll come back to you. Do you have further agenda items to get done before the president finishes off his term? You obviously, TPP is the crown jewel of everything after that TTIP to get something teed up for the next administration. What other goals would you have between now and the end?
We're working on a environmental goods agreement with countries representing about 90% of the environmental goods market. And again, the goal is to eliminate tariffs on clean energy and clean tech products to help get them into the dispersed into markets as much and as quickly as possible. We're working on an agreement on services that represents about 70% of the global economy. And we're working to revitalize the multilateral trading system itself. We've had over the course of the last several years a realization that the Doha round, as it has been negotiated, as it has been structured, was unlikely to reach a successful conclusion on the path we were on. And now we have a real robust and honest discussion going on in Geneva about how to revitalize the WTO and the multilateral trading system, both in terms of dealing with outstanding issues in new ways, but also what new issues the WTO system might take on, and that's a priority for us as well.
Right, and is it true, I mean, I read a lot that the administration is not particularly interested in bilateral trade agreements anymore. It has to be, these big group deals like the TPP. Is that true? And do you think that's going to be the model going forward, that there's just multi-nation trade agreements that are put together and the age of sort of, one-to-one bilateral trade agreements is kind of done?
I can't speak for a future administration, and every country will do their own thing. And some countries are doing multiple things. I mean, China, as I mentioned, is negotiating a series of bilateral trade agreements, but also negotiating a mega regional agreement, RCEP. Our approach has been, if we can agree with a diverse set of countries, developed and developing countries, on a set of high standard rules, that then serves as a magnet for other countries to join and to sign on to those rules. And that's what we're seeing already with TPP, as I mentioned, and that's what we expect to see in TTIP as well.
Right. I think this is creating some kind of feedback loop here. You should always turn off your cell phone when you come on these panels, or you could create large problems. Talk about the Obama administration more broadly, your experience in it, and the legacy you think the president will leave, particularly on the economy. Just give us the Froman view of how the world has changed under President Obama and how history will remember him and the legacy that he leaves behind.
Well, look, I think it's important to remember that when he came into office, we were losing 800,000 jobs a month, that the economy was in free fall, that there was a real risk of a global depression, and that through a series of politically bold and painful actions, he was able to avoid that global depression and revitalize the auto industry, restructure our regulation around the financial sector. And as a result, while there's still much work to be done, we've come out of the recession in many respects better than many of our colleagues and competitors around the world. We're growing. We've added 14 million new jobs. Unemployment is down. Wages are finally ticking up, too slowly and too little, but I think last year was about 2.5% in nominal terms. We've got a long way to go in that regard. And we've got a healthier financial system, and a housing industry is coming back. I think that's going to be a key part of his legacy. Obviously, expanding health care for 20 million additional people will be a very, very important part of his legacy. Withdrawing from 2 wars, bringing 100,000 American soldiers back to the United States will be key, and taking a major step to address global terrorism, I think, is going to be.
So why, I mean, if all these things are true, and they are from a numerical perspective, why are people so angry? Why are we in a campaign in which rage is the dominating factor on both the right and the left, and that Republicans are about to nominate, this sort of rage candidate, and on the Democratic side, you've had a very powerful insurgent populist challenge from Bernie Sanders to Hillary Clinton. I mean, the obvious answer is the wage piece. But I mean, have there been failures of this administration in any way that have led to a 2016 campaign that is, I think, just depresses everybody in its ugliness and nastiness, and is not anything that anybody's looking forward to? And that Washington is as dysfunctional and gridlocked as it's ever been, more so than when the president came into office. I mean, it's, the numbers, the macro numbers are pretty good. The actual reality on the ground of how Americans get along with each other and how they feel about their country is not so good. And, is any of that to lay at the feet of the Obama administration?
Well, look, I think...
Cop to all your sins is what I'm asking you to do.
Look, I think there is as much work that has been done and as much has been accomplished. Obviously, it's an unfinished agenda, and there's always more work to be done. And in fact, by dealing with some of these big issues, like avoiding a global depression, like saving the auto industry, like expanding healthcare, it has focused attention on the fact that we still need to rebuild our infrastructure, and that we need to reform and strengthen our capacity in science and technology education and math. There are many things that we need to do to maintain a global leadership role. And I think the president has done a very good job of doing many of those things. But there are many proposals he made that didn't go anywhere with Congress. There is a limit to what he could do through administrative action. And I think these are going to be part of the ongoing challenges of whoever comes in the next administration to do.
I mean, do you have a satisfying explanation personally for why there seems to be so much anger in the country, and people are motivated in politics now by, not necessarily purely partisan issues, but just a sense that the system is broken, Washington is broken, and we need outside disruptors to change it? Like, when you think about where we are now, what do you think causes that? What is the remedy for that? Are we going to get to a point where people are kind of, I don't know, nicer to each other?
That's a deep philosophical question that is way beyond my ability to answer. First of all, let me say, this is not a uniquely American phenomenon at the moment. You look across Europe, you look elsewhere, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction with institutions, with leadership, and I think people ultimately want to see things getting done. And I know the president is frustrated that he wasn't able to accomplish as much as he did accomplish. There was much more he would have liked to accomplish with the support of Congress or on a bipartisan basis. And I think ultimately part of that reaction you're seeing in the public is to the dysfunctionality of the system and the failure of the system to deliver as much as they had hoped. That again is, I think, an ongoing project that we're all going to have to address as we get through this election.
Okay. And give us quickly the how TPP is going to address this in some small way, that how it's going to make Americans' lives better, how it's going to improve the U.S. economy, improve job creation, and the pace of growth. It's relatively anemic. What will the U.S. economy look like post-TPP?
Well, look, probably the best independent analysis of TPP is the one that's been done by the Peterson Institute, which has been the most in-depth. And it's concluded that TPP will add $130 billion to the U.S. economy when fully implemented. That'll increase U.S. exports by $350 billion a year. That the majority of the benefits will go to workers, both skilled and unskilled workers. And if you think intuitively, we know that every $1 billion of export supports 5,000 to 7,000 U.S. jobs, and that those jobs pay on average up to 18% more than non-export related jobs in the same sector. So the more exports you have, the more jobs are supported by exports, the more well-paying jobs you have, and that helps deal with issues like wage stagnation and income inequality, and we see that as part of the whole benefit.
Yeah. Did anyone come up with a smart question for the ambassador? I think we have one in the back.
My question is, how does the TPP look through Japanese eyes, the politics in Japan and their angle on it?
That's a good question. I think starting with Prime Minister Noda, but then very much Prime Minister Abe, viewed TPP as supportive of the actions that they wanted to take to reform their own economy. It's often thought of as part of the third arrow of Abenomics in terms of helping to support the structural reform, whether it's the agrarian sector, labor reform, services reform. And I believe the Prime Minister has been pretty explicit about the importance that he puts on TPP in that regard. But I think Japan also views it as we do, as a key part of our rebalancing strategy towards Asia. And the strategic benefits of having a mechanism that brings the U.S. closer to key partners in the region at a time when the region is very much in flux. So whether it's our treaty partners like Japan and Australia, New Zealand in the region, or our other trading partners, Vietnam, Malaysia, et cetera, who very much want the U.S. to be embedded in their lives and see TPP as important as a strategic matter as it is an economic matter.
Yeah. And are there political considerations in the other signatory nations that are going to slow this thing down? I have not focused very carefully on what the other dozen countries, where they are in the process. I know a lot of them have similar kind of political issues that we have in the United States around, the impact of free trade. Could other countries block this thing from happening?
Well, every country's got its own process for approving it and also its own politics. I think they're all moving forward through this process. Most of them are either parliamentary systems or have some other mechanism for efficiently approving trade agreements like this and implementing the necessary legislative changes. And they're working their way through that. So I don't expect that any of them will ultimately block this from happening.
Even New Zealand, haven't they been sort of noisy on some things?
I think there's been a public debate in most of the countries about this in various ways. Mm-hmm. But our understanding is that the leadership in those countries feel comfortable that they're making the necessary progress to build support for it in their systems.
Okay. Do we have more questions? There's one in the back corner here.
By means of confession, I'm a Republican state office holder, okay? And whether I agree or disagree with you, I went to one of our caucuses, and normally I know people. I knew about 3 people, and we had about 2,000 or 3,000 people show up. And I guess what I'm suggesting to you is that, and I think as our moderator said, is all of what you said may be great, but I think this is what people are upset about, is that you're like patting them on the head saying, Sonny, don't worry, this is going to be, I'm talking about the TPP. But as I say, I'm curious your opinion. And they're working 2 jobs, they don't see their kids, and this is widespread.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can just come back and tell people about all the great benefits when they look around and they just don't see it.
Right.
Well, I think it's, first of all, I hope that I didn't come across as patting them on their head. I quite the opposite. My point of view is the following. Their concerns are real. Their concerns that they may have had a manufacturing job that paid $30 an hour and had good benefits, and they could achieve a middle-class life like their parents did, and now they're working 2 services jobs with lower benefits, and they're having trouble living up to those same standards. I think that is real, and that's a lot of the underlying concern that we see in the debate right now about wages, about the ability to achieve the American dream, about the future of the middle class. The question is, what do you do about it? If TPP didn't exist, that problem would continue to exist. And indeed, we'd be competing against low-wage labor around the rest of the world. We'd have barriers to our exports. 70% tariffs, autos going into Vietnam. 55% tariffs on machinery that we make, that we're globally competitive in, that we can export all over the world. 40% tariffs on poultry, 38.5% tariffs on beef. These are the kind of tariffs we face in other countries. Our average applied tariff is 1.4%. So if TPP doesn't move forward, we face barriers to our exports. We face imports coming in from the rest of the world because as we grow, we tend to suck in imports into our country. Our view is we can complain about the tides coming in, or we can do something about it. And TPP is our ability to do something about it, to shape globalization, to get rid of the barriers to our exports, to raise standards in other countries, so that we can have more investment in manufacturing in the US, so that we can see the benefits going to workers in terms of higher wages, and so that they can see more opportunity in building things here, growing things here, and sending them all over the world than they do right now. And that, I think, is the big challenge, is that people will criticize TPP, but they don't have what their alternative is for shaping the things that they're complaining about.
Right.
If you're worried about China, if you think China is eating our lunch, if you are worried that China is going to set the rules of the road for the world, then you should be the stronger supporter of TPP. Because without TPP, that's certainly going to be the case.
I mean, I guess would it make sense to say that the diagnosis is correct, that people are angry and they're unhappy with the number of jobs they have to work to make ends meet and, like the gentleman said, not see their families. And all of that is quite real and quite legitimate and understandable, but the prescribed remedies for that would come from Trump in particular would not help those people. It would not make that situation better. That's not the answer is not protectionism and mercantilism. The answer may be in these sort of high standard trade agreements that you're talking about, that it's easy to scapegoat them and to use them as the boogeyman that created these problems, but maybe that's not really the situation.
Look, I think that's right. I think that, but it underscores that we need to take these concerns very seriously because they are legitimate, and we need to look not just in the trade world but outside the trade world of what it is we need to do to address the concerns that people have, because ultimately we are going to live in a global economy, and the global economy is going to have an effect on them, and we need to equip them to be able to succeed in the global economy, both by the tools we give them here and how we shape the rules around the rest of the world.
Right. Okay, we probably have time for one more if there's one in the room right here.
You're from Northern California, and the tech sector up there has a tendency to assert that the center of gravity in the U.S. at least is shifting toward the West. And I'm curious, you talk about getting closer to our partners across the Pacific. To what extent does this agreement kind of bring the center of gravity that's traditionally been in D.C. and New York a little bit more to the West Coast?
Well, I think California is particularly well positioned to benefit from TPP. In fact, no other state, I think, can benefit as much as California does. California already exports $170 billion a year of goods, not to mention services. And we're strong in manufacturing, we're strong in agriculture, we're strong in the service sector, we're strong in the high-tech sector, we're strong when it comes to the entertainment industry and the IP industries, IP-intensive industries. We're strong when it comes to biotech. All of those areas will benefit from this agreement. And of course, as the gateway to this region, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, the airports, the logistics companies, all stand to benefit tremendously, not just from what's produced in California, but what's produced all over the country. So California really has a great deal to benefit from this. And I think whether it signifies a shift from the East Coast to the West Coast, certainly the West Coast is going to very much be part of this Asia-Pacific region that is becoming so important. We're going to have over 3 billion middle-class consumers in the Asia-Pacific region by 2030. We need to be part of that market. We can't be globally competitive. Our firms cannot be globally competitive if we are excluded from the largest and fastest growing middle-class market in the world, and that's why this is so important.
I'm glad you didn't start a two-pack biggie East Coast, West Coast feud on economic growth and who benefits the most from TPP. I would press you on exactly when you're going to get the votes and the total votes you're going to get for this thing. I know you won't give me an answer anyway, and we're out of time. So thanks to Ambassador Froman for a great discussion. Thank you all for coming.